Micah Reed had never thought much about women's pain. Not really. Not the way a man should. Sure, he'd seen the tears and the quiet grief when a wife lost a child. He'd seen how some men grew distant, how some women folded into themselves like dying flowers. But he'd always figured that was part of life, dust and loss, just like drought or cattle sickness. Something to endure, not something to carry in your chest every day. That changed the day he rode into Bell Creek. It was late spring, and the prairie grass rolled soft and green under a sky wide enough to drown in. Micah was just looking to trade in his horse's worn-out shoes and maybe get a decent night's sleep. He'd been trailing a small herd north from Abilene and hadn't talked to a soul in 3 days. He was bone-tired and hadn't even thought of company, let alone the kind that would pull his whole life sideways. The first woman he saw was standing behind the church. She looked too thin for a dress and too still for a living thing. Her eyes were fixed on the creek, arms wrapped around herself like she was cold, though the sun was high. He figured she was mourning something and was about to ride past. But then he noticed the suitcase on the ground beside her. A suitcase meant she was leaving, or worse, had been told to go. The second woman was sitting on the church steps. Older, late 30s, maybe early 40s, with sharp lines in her face like someone who'd stopped smiling years ago. She didn't cry, didn't even blink when Micah tied his horse nearby. Just looked him up and down like he was a stray dog wandering too close to her porch. He cleared his throat. "Beg your pardon, ma'am. You all right?" The older one snorted. "You from around here?" "No, ma'am. Just passing through." Then passed through. That should have been the end of it. But Micah didn't move. Something wasn't right. The younger woman hadn't spoken, hadn't looked up. Micah looked at the older one again. She wasn't scared. She was furious and hurt in that quiet, bitter way women get when they've been pushed too far and no one's come looking. "She yours?" he asked, nodding toward the girl by the creek. The older woman narrowed her eyes. "She's nobody's, least of all theirs." Micah followed her gaze toward the church doors. A man in a dark coat had just stepped out, thin, stiff as a post, mouth pinched like he'd been sucking on lemons. A preacher, from the look of it. He saw Micah, then the suitcase, then turned and walked right back inside. Micah waited a long minute, then spoke again. "What happened?" "She lost a baby," the older woman said flat. Second time. Her husband said, "God, don't give children to unworthy women." Told her she was cursed. Preacher agreed. Threw her out. Micah blinked. They threw her out of her home. No, the woman snapped. They threw her out of the church. Then her husband threw her out of the house. Left her standing in the snow with nothing but that bag. He didn't know what to say. All the wind in his lungs was gone. That girl couldn't have been older than 25. She had brown hair hanging limp over her face and skin pale like candle wax. She looked like she'd stopped living the day she stopped bleeding. "And you?" he asked the older woman. "I'm her sister-in-law. Or was. I stayed when my own baby died, thinking my husband would soften. But he said I must have sinned. He stopped touching me, stopped talking to me, took up with a widow in town, and said I should be grateful he didn't send me packing too. But when they came for her," she nodded toward the younger woman, "I couldn't stand by. I left. Where are you going?" "We don't know," she said. "Somewhere the Bible don't get used as a whip. Somewhere a woman's worth more than her womb." The words sat heavy between them. Micah glanced at the horse, then the town. This wasn't his fight. He didn't know these women, didn't know them anything. But the thing was, he'd seen too many things go unpunished. Seen women walk out of town in the dark with nothing but tears and bruises, and nobody ever asked where they went. And now, two were standing right in front of him. He looked at the younger one again. She still hadn't moved. "What's her name?" he asked. "Naomi. She gonna be all right?" "I don't know," the older woman said quietly. "I don't think she wants to be." Micah stared out at the hills. He could just ride on, let someone else take care of it. But something inside him wouldn't let him. Maybe it was the way Naomi looked like she'd already died and just hadn't told her body yet. Or maybe it was the sister-in-law's voice, filled with more fire than fear. Whatever it was, Micah had turned back toward them. "I got a wagon," he said. "I was hauling supplies, but the job fell through. Got room, if you need to get somewhere." The older woman hesitated. "You don't even know us." "No," Micah agreed. "But I know what it looks like when a town don't care who it hurts. And I've watched too many people get left behind." She looked at Naomi, then back at Micah. "I'm Sarah." He nodded. "Micah Reed. Where you headed?" "North. Thinking about settling near the Green River. Heard there's good land. And not too many folks to tell you what kind of life you're allowed to live." Sarah studied him a moment, then picked up the suitcase. "All right, Mr. Reed. We'll ride with you." Micah helped them up into the wagon. Naomi didn't speak, didn't even meet his eyes. She just sat there, hands folded in her lap like a doll someone left in the rain. Sarah kept a hand on her shoulder the whole time, steady and strong. As they rolled out of Bell Creek, Micah looked once over his shoulder. The church bell rang, but no one came out. The whole town stayed quiet, like it had already forgotten the two women it cast out. But Micah hadn't, not by a long shot. They made camp that first night just past a stretch of cottonwoods near a shallow bend in the river. The stars were sharp above them, the sky black as ink. Micah kept the fire low, not because he feared anyone was following, but because quiet felt right. Naomi hadn't spoken a word all day. Sarah filled the silence when needed, giving directions, asking questions about the trail. But even she kept her voice low, like they were afraid to stir something broken inside the girl. Micah had been around grief before. He'd seen mothers claw at fresh graves, seen fathers go silent for months after burying a child. But Naomi's grief was different. It wasn't loud or sharp. It was flat, like all the air had gone out of her lungs, and she didn't care if it ever came back. She moved like her body was foreign to her, like she was just borrowing it for the sake of breathing a little longer. Sarah sat beside the fire and finally told Micah the full story. Naomi had grown up in Bell Creek. Her daddy was a blacksmith, good man, but worn down early by work and whiskey. Her mother died in childbirth when Naomi was 12. From then on, it was just her and her father, and he taught her to be quiet, to keep her head low, and to marry a man who could keep food on the table. When she turned 19, she married Abram Sutter, the preacher's nephew, a man who could quote half the Old Testament by heart and believed women were born to serve and suffer in silence. The first miscarriage came early in the marriage, and Abram blamed the devil. Said Naomi had let wicked thoughts into her heart. The second one came after 2 years of trying, and that time he didn't blame the devil. He blamed her. The preacher laid hands on her, Sarah said, the flames flickering in her eyes. Said he was praying for healing. But what he was really doing was setting her up to be shamed. When she didn't heal, they called her unclean. Abram locked her out of the house that night. I found her sitting on our porch, covered in snow, lips blue. Micah stared into the fire. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. "And you stay with your husband after that?" Sarah nodded slowly. "I shouldn't have. I told myself I was trying to help her from the inside. But really I was afraid. It's hard to walk away when you've got no money, no name of your own. When you're told for years that your worth is tied to a child you can't have." He looked up at her. She was tough, maybe the toughest woman he'd ever met. But there was pain under the grit. It made sense now, the way she held herself, the sharpness in her voice. She wasn't just angry at the men who hurt Naomi. She was angry at herself for letting it happen. Micah added a stick to the fire. "You got family outside Bell Creek?" "No, my people are gone. I'm married into the Sutters. They were all I had, until I realized they weren't worth having. Still a hard thing, to leave everything behind." Sarah shrugged. "What's the point of staying when you're already invisible?" That night, Micah took first watch while the women slept. Naomi didn't move once beneath the blanket. Her face stayed turned toward the dark trees, as if something out there still had a hold on her. In the days that followed, Micah tried not to push, but he kept his eyes open. Sarah warmed up quicker. She had a dry wit and wasn't afraid to poke fun at his cooking or the way he shaved with cold water like a lunatic. But Naomi stayed locked inside herself. She rode in silence, barely ate, and only spoke in whispers to Sarah when no one else was listening. By the fourth day, they passed through a trading post near the Kansas border. It was a rough little place with two dusty buildings and a couple of wagons out front. The owner, a wiry man with a bent back named Lyle, ran the place with his wife and teenage son. Micah had been there once before and knew they were good people. No judgment, no sermons. While Sarah haggled for flour and beans, Micah led the horses to water. Naomi stayed in the wagon. He saw her fingers move once, brushing the edge of her skirt like she was grounding herself, and then go still again. Lyle's wife, Martha, brought out a small loaf of bread and offered it to Naomi. At first, Naomi didn't react. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. "Thank you," she whispered. It was the first word Micah had heard from her in days. Back on the trail, Sarah noticed too. "She's talking. That's something." "She's waking up a little," Micah said. "Maybe we just give it time." But time, they soon learned, wasn't something they had in abundance. That evening, just before sunset, they found hoof prints near their campsite. Fresh. Micah crouched over them, fingers in the dirt. "Two riders," he muttered. "Not from town. Boots don't match anything I've seen in Bell Creek." Sarah stepped closer. "You think they're following us?" Could be. Could be they're just passing through. But I don't like the look of it." From that moment on, Micah kept his rifle closer. He let the women sleep while he stayed up, listening for broken twigs or the sound of distant hoofs. Twice he saw movement in the distance, shadows against the ridgeline, but no one ever came close. The tension began to change them. Naomi started to watch Micah more closely. Not fearfully, but with curiosity, like she was trying to measure what kind of man he was. She asked him once where he came from. "Arkansas," he told her. "Farm boy. Had 6 brothers. None of them made it past 25. 2 got sick. 1 fell from a roof. 1 shot himself. The last 2 died in the war." "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Me too." That night, she offered to help cook. The beans were scorched, but Micah didn't care. The simple act of her doing anything was a small kind of miracle. Sarah noticed too. "She's not broken," she said softly. "Just bruised real bad, like a bird that forgot how to fly." Micah nodded, but inside, something sharp twisted. He knew what happened to women like Naomi. If they didn't break outright, they curled inward until they disappeared. He didn't know how to fix that, but he knew he couldn't stand to see it happen again. They made good time the next few days. The air turned cooler. The trees grew taller. They were close to the Wyoming border when the trouble found them. It started with the smell, burnt pine. Then came the sound of gunshots. Micah pulled the wagon off the road and ordered Sarah and Naomi to hide beneath a patch of boulders. He crept forward with his rifle and saw smoke rising from a nearby cabin. Nothing left but a charred frame and 3 horses tied out front. Then he saw the bodies. 2 men, maybe more, shot dead, their pockets turned out. Whoever had done it wasn't far ahead. Micah returned to the women with his face like stone. "We'll keep riding," he said. "Stay off the main trail. I don't want to run into whoever did that." Sarah nodded. Outlaws, or worse, men who don't care what they take. The danger sharpened everything. Naomi didn't fade anymore. She watched. She listened. The wind came colder once they crossed into Wyoming territory. Trees stood taller here, pine and spruce replacing the cottonwoods, and the air smelled of moss and rock and river. It was wild land, the kind that swallowed men whole if they weren't paying attention. But something about it seemed to breathe easier, like it was free from the rot that hung over places like Bell Creek. The wagon creaked steadily over dirt and gravel, its wheels coated with the red dust of miles already left behind. They hadn't seen another soul in 2 days, and Micah began to think maybe the men who'd been following them had given up or been killed by someone even meaner. Either way, he didn't want to let his guard down. But inside the quiet, something else had begun to grow, a strange kind of peace, like their little party was no longer just thrown together by pain, but slowly stitching itself into something steadier. Naomi still didn't speak much, but she no longer moved like a ghost. She rose with the sun, helped Sarah cook, and once even laughed, soft and surprised, when a squirrel jumped into their flour tin and scattered the powder like snow. It was a tiny sound barely there, but it struck Micah deep like a match lit in a cold room. He didn't talk about what he felt. He barely admitted it to himself. But the longer they traveled, the more he noticed her in quiet moments. How she tilted her head when listening to birds, how her hands shook when she threaded a needle, how sometimes she stared at the sky like she was begging for something. Not mercy exactly, just a reason to keep going. One evening, just as the last light slipped behind the trees, Naomi sat beside him by the fire. Sarah had turned in early with a headache, leaving the two of them alone. Naomi had her knees pulled up, chin resting atop them. Her hair hung loose around her face. Micah didn't say anything at first. He wasn't sure he should, but then she spoke, her voice low, the words slow and careful like she was pulling them out of someplace deep. "My first baby was a girl," she said. He turned to her, but didn't speak. "I was 5 months along. Felt her kick. I named her even though Abram told me not to. I called her Ruth, after my mother." Micah nodded once. "That's a good name." Naomi's gaze stayed on the fire. "She was gone before I could hold her. I buried her behind the house, near the lilacs. Abram didn't say a word. He wouldn't let me mark the spot. Said God had already done the judging." Micah felt his throat tighten. "I'm sorry." She didn't cry. She didn't even blink hard. It was like the grief had already burned through her and left something smoother behind, raw but no longer sharp. "I keep seeing her," she went on, "not as a baby, as a girl. Dark hair, small hands. I don't know why, but it keeps me breathing, like maybe some part of her stayed. In me." Micah swallowed and poked at the fire, trying to keep his voice steady. "If there's any justice in this world, she's still with you." Somehow, Naomi turned her head. For the first time, she met his eyes, really met them. There wasn't fear there anymore, just quiet searching. "You ever have someone you lost?" she asked. Micah didn't answer right away. Then he leaned back against a log and stared up at the stars. "My youngest brother," he said, "Josiah. He was 14 when the war ended. Too young to fight. But he followed me when I went to join the wagon trains west. Thought we'd find adventure. Thought we'd be men. What happened? Snakebite. Out near the Platte. I was gone for 2 hours looking for firewood. When I got back, he was already going cold." Naomi lowered her head. "I'm sorry." Micah nodded slowly. "I still dream about him, mostly when it's quiet like this." They sat in silence after that, not needing more. The fire crackled, the air turned cool, and for the first time since they left Bell Creek, Naomi didn't flinch when their shoulders brushed. Small things started to change. Sarah noticed it first. She teased Naomi one morning after Micah helped her down from the wagon, her hand lingering a second longer than needed. "Careful," Sarah said with a sly grin. "You keep looking at him like that, and he might start thinking he's handsome." Naomi flushed pink, but didn't pull away. Micah pretended not to hear, but his chest warmed with something close to pride and fear. He hadn't planned on caring this much. He hadn't planned on staying close, or being needed, or imagining what it might be like to build something again with her. They stopped in a small settlement near Laramie to restock. It was nothing more than a general store, a saloon, and a stable. But it had a creek, and that night Naomi walked barefoot to its edge, letting her feet sink into the cold mud. Micah followed at a distance, unsure if she wanted company. "I used to do this as a child," she said when she noticed him. "Back behind the churchyard, there was a stream. I'd sneak out at dusk and soak my feet, even when the pastor said it was sinful." Micah grinned. He thought soaking your feet was sinful. He thought anything that made you feel free was sinful. She looked up, and there was something playful in her eyes now. It startled him, like seeing sunlight after a storm. He took off his boots and stepped in beside her. The creek water was icy, but they stood there together until the stars came out and the bugs started singing in the reeds. Neither of them said anything more, but something passed between them all the same. Later that night, Sarah pulled Micah aside while Naomi slept. "She's waking up," she said. "You've done more for her than I ever could." Micah shook his head. "It's not me. It's the trail, the quiet, getting away from all the voices that told her she was nothing." Sarah studied him a moment. "Maybe, or maybe it's because you don't ask her to be anything she ain't. You just let her be." Micah looked back toward the campfire, where Naomi lay curled in her blanket. "She deserves peace," he said softly. "She deserves a life." Sarah touched his arm gently. "And what about you?" Micah blinked. "What do you mean? You act like you're carrying everyone else's sorrow, but not your own. You help, you protect, but do you ever stop and ask yourself what you want?" He didn't answer right away, but the truth had been circling him for days now, and he couldn't pretend not to feel it. "I want to stop running," he said finally. "I've been riding half my life, never staying in one place more than a season. Always thought settling down meant giving something up. But with her," he paused, heart thudding. "It feels different." Sarah smiled, quiet and knowing. "Then maybe you stop riding." The next few days passed softer. They laughed more. Naomi looked out over the valley, something unreadable in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she said. Sarah smiled. "You think you could live here?" Naomi didn't answer at first. Then she nodded, her voice soft. "I think I could start again here." They set up camp in the open, choosing a rise near the river. Micah began building a shelter using fallen branches and rope, while Sarah and Naomi gathered wild greens nearby. The work was slow but good. It filled their days with purpose. That night, after dinner, Micah handed Naomi a folded cloth. Inside it was a wooden carving, a bird, small and simple, shaped like a sparrow. "I'm no artist," he said, "but I thought maybe you'd like something to keep." Naomi turned it over in her hands, and her lips trembled. "It's beautiful." He sat beside her. The fire crackled low. "I don't know what you need," he said, "or where your road leads. But if you ever decide to stay, really stay, I'd like to build something with you. A house, a life, whatever you want." Naomi looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "I don't know if I can give you children," she whispered. Micah reached out, brushing her hair from her face. "I'm not asking for that," he said. "I'm asking for you." She leaned into him, then, slowly, resting her head on his shoulder. And there in the dark, with the fire burning low and the river whispering nearby, they found a moment of peace, a moment that felt like the beginning of something whole. It started with a cold wind from the west, not the kind that brushed her coat and moved on, but the kind that carried something with it, an unease that settled into Micah's bones long before he understood why. They'd been working the land for weeks, digging post holes, clearing stones from what would one day be a vegetable patch, building up the cabin log by log. Naomi had taken to planting wildflowers by the door, as if beauty might keep ghosts away. Sarah was stronger, too, her coughs fewer now that she had good food in her belly and steady sleep. But none of it stopped the feeling that something was changing again, like calm before a storm. Micah noticed it first in Naomi, how her eyes lingered longer on the horizon, how her hands trembled when they were still. She smiled less. Her sleep turned restless. Once he found her down by the river at dawn, staring into the water like she might see something in its reflection that the rest of them couldn't. When he asked her if she was all right, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Some days are just heavier than others. He let it lie. Maybe he shouldn't have. The fear crept up quiet. It wasn't just in Naomi. It was in him too. He'd let himself believe things might stay good, that they'd outrun the pain in the past. But nothing stays still in this world, and he knew it. He'd seen too many homesteads built with love, only to be burned down by chance, or men too angry to leave others be. Then came the letter. It arrived by horseback from a traveling merchant, addressed to Sarah. Her hands shook as she read it, her mouth tightening. She folded the paper slowly and didn't speak for a long while. Micah and Naomi sat waiting, tension humming between them. It's from my cousin back in Nebraska, she said finally. The McCraes found out I'm still alive. They've been telling folks I ran off with a thief. They're calling it abandonment. Naomi went pale. Why would they lie like that? Because they need to be right, Sarah said. Because they can't stand that someone might have survived them. Micah clenched his fists. Are they coming? Don't know. But if they are, they'll bring the law. And they'll twist the truth until it sounds like gospel. Naomi looked at him, then Sarah. If they take her back, they'll kill her. We won't let them, Micah said. I've got deeds for the land now, and I'll stand between them and this place if I have to. But the damage was already done. Naomi started pulling away again, quiet as snowfall. She stopped sitting by the fire at night. She barely ate. Micah tried to reach her, but every time he got close, she pulled back like she was slipping into some place he couldn't follow. One night, after Sarah had gone to bed, he finally pressed. What's going on in your head? He asked, gentle but firm. Naomi stared at the fire, arms wrapped around herself. I was starting to believe we were safe, she said. That I could build something here. That maybe I wasn't ruined. You're not ruined, he said quickly. She turned to him, eyes glassy. But I am. Micah, I still wake up some nights and forget where I am. I forget Ruth is gone. I reach for her in the dark. Then I remember, and it feels like dying all over again. Micah reached for her hand, but she didn't take it. What if I can't ever be whole again? She whispered. What if I love you, and still that part of me never comes back? His heart thudded. The word love hit him like thunder, but it came laced with sorrow. Then I'll love the part of you that's left, he said. Every broken, beautiful piece. She shook her head. That's not fair to you. I get to decide what's fair, he said. Naomi looked at him then, and for a moment he thought maybe she'd let herself fall into his arms. But instead, she stood up and walked into the dark, back to the cabin without another word. He didn't follow. Some wounds needed silence before they could start to close. The next few days passed cold and tense. Naomi barely spoke. Micah worked harder, threw himself into the land like he could sweat the fear out. Sarah tried to mediate, but it was like a wall had gone up between them, one made not of anger, but of sadness too thick to climb over. Then came the stranger. Micah spotted him first, riding a dun-colored horse, wearing a long coat that flapped in the wind. He didn't approach fast. He came careful, slow, the way men do when they're either lost or looking for something they'd rather not announce. They still held pain, but it wasn't hollow anymore. It was sharp, alive. I want to go back, she said. Not to hide, to stand. If that man comes with the law, I want to be there beside you. They rode back the next day. Micah didn't ask for promises. Naomi didn't offer any. But when they reached the cabin, she took his hand and didn't let go. They spent the next week getting ready. Not just for the man or the marshal, but for whatever came after. Naomi helped Micah finish the fence. Sarah baked bread from scratch. They sat out at night and talked about dreams, not big ones, just ones like a small barn, a proper front porch, maybe even a dog. When the lawyer returned with the marshal, Naomi stepped forward before Micah could say a word. My name is Naomi, she said, loud and clear. I buried a child, survived a husband who hated me for it, and lived through a world that tried to erase me. I'm not going back. And if you have a warrant, you better make it count. The marshal looked between them, then at the lawyer. I don't see a crime here. The lawyer scowled but didn't argue. He tipped his hat and left. And just like that, the air shifted. The wind didn't feel so heavy anymore. Naomi turned to Micah, her hand still trembling in his. I'm still scared, she said. So am I, he said. But fear don't get to run the show. And for the first time in months, she smiled, a real smile, cracked and bright. They stood together at the edge of the cabin as the sun set over the valley, casting gold across the land they'd chosen. Not because it was safe, but because it was theirs. The morning air was sharp, colder than usual for late spring. Micah woke early, the first pale light creeping over the ridge, and felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. Today was the day they'd feared but had also prepared for, when the past would come knocking hard, demanding answers forgiveness, or surrender. He didn't say much as he moved around camp, gathering wood, checking the fence posts, but inside, his mind was a whirl of memories, worries, and the fierce need to protect what little they'd built. Naomi was quiet, too. She had been since the lawyer left, her gaze distant, hands busy but tense. Micah caught her once staring at the wooden sparrow he had carved for her months ago, the small piece of hope he had given her when she thought none was left. It sat on the rough table beside her bedroll, a reminder of something fragile but real. They had agreed on one thing. No matter what came, they would face it together. The distant sound of hooves echoed across the valley just as the sun began to climb. Micah's heart quickened. Two riders appeared on the trail, dusty and grim-faced. One was the marshal who had come before. The other was a tall man with cold eyes and a jaw like a stone. Micah felt the old tightness creep into his chest. Years of hard fighting, running, hiding, but this time he wasn't alone. Naomi stepped beside him, her hand slipping into his without hesitation. The riders dismounted and approached slowly. The tall man introduced himself as Sheriff McCrae, the cousin who had sent the lawyer before. His eyes flicked over the land, the cabin, the three who stood ready. "You're trespassing on McCrae property," the sheriff said flatly. "Sarah is coming home. You have no claim here." Micah squared his shoulders. "This land's ours now. You have no proof to say otherwise." Sheriff McCrae smirked. "You're a fool if you think a claim from a broke cowboy holds against a McCrae." Naomi stepped forward, voice steady but fierce. "I'm not Sarah, but I'm the woman who stood by her. And we're not leaving." The tension hung thick in the air, as if the earth itself held its breath. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're messing with." "I know enough to stand my ground," Micah replied. Then the sheriff's expression shifted, sharper and colder. "You don't belong here, Dobson. You're running from more than just the law. You're running from yourself." Micah's fists clenched. This was it, the fight he'd been avoiding for years. "You don't know a damn thing about me," he said, voice low. Sheriff McCrae smiled thinly. "I know about your brother Josiah, about how you left him to die out there on the trail, how you ran while he was dying." Micah's breath caught. The name, the memory, it was a wound he'd never spoken of aloud. "I didn't leave him," Micah said, voice trembling. "I went for help. He died before I got back." "Some say you were scared," the sheriff said, stepping closer, "that you chose yourself over family." Naomi stepped between them, eyes blazing. "That's enough." The sheriff turned to her. "And you? You're nothing but a liar running from your own guilt." Naomi's face twisted with pain. "I lost my baby, not because I'm weak, but because the man I trusted turned on me, because I was blamed for things beyond my control." The air was heavy with years of hurt and blame, the weight of secrets finally spilling into daylight. Micah looked at Naomi and saw the fear he'd tried to bury, the fear she might never be free from the past that haunted her. He stepped forward, voice steady but fierce. "We're not running anymore. Not from the past, not from pain. We stand here, together." The sheriff sneered, but something in Micah's stance made him hesitate. Naomi took a deep breath, voice trembling but sure. "I'm not afraid anymore. I'm not a mistake or a failure. I'm a woman who's fought to live, to love, to heal." She looked at Micah, "And I'm willing to fight for that." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind through the trees. Then the sheriff spat on the ground. "This isn't over." But he mounted his horse, and the marshal followed. They rode off slowly, the tension easing but the threat still lingering like a shadow. After they left, Micah and Naomi stood in the quiet. "I don't know if this will ever end," Naomi said softly. "Maybe it won't," Micah said. "But we're stronger than our fears, and we don't have to face them alone anymore." She leaned into him, the weight of the day melting into something fragile and new, a chance at peace, at a life rebuilt from broken pieces. In that moment, the past didn't feel so heavy. It was just another part of the road they had traveled, one they could face, one they could leave behind. Together, the sun dipped low, spilling a warm glow over the cabin and the wide stretch of land beyond. Micah and Naomi sat side by side on the porch steps, their hands resting close but not quite touching. The day's tension had faded, replaced by a quiet that felt both fragile and full of promise. Somewhere behind them, Sarah hummed softly in the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread drifting through the open window. It was a simple moment, but one Micah and Naomi both knew carried the weight of everything they'd been through. Naomi let out a slow breath, her eyes tracing the horizon where the sky met the rolling hills. "It's strange," she said, voice low, "how a place can feel empty and full at the same time." Micah nodded. "That's what home is. A space for loss and love to live side by side." She turned to him then, the faintest smile brushing her lips. "I never thought I'd find that again. Not after everything." "Neither did I," he admitted. "But maybe that's why it means so much now." Their hands finally met, fingers curling together with a tenderness that spoke of trust, of healing. It wasn't a grand gesture or a sudden spark. It was slow, steady, like the steady pulse of the land beneath them. They talked in whispers, sharing hopes too fragile to speak aloud before. Dreams of a small garden that might feed more than just their bodies. A patch of wildflowers Naomi would tend without fear. A porch swing that creaked with afternoon sun. It was the kind of dreaming that felt real because it was built on the hard work of survival. Later, inside the cabin's warm glow, they moved closer. No words were needed, just the quiet understanding that this was a beginning. Naomi's hand found Micah's face, tracing the lines carved by years of struggle and quiet strength. Micah's breath hitched as he leaned into her touch, feeling the steady beat of her heart. They didn't rush. There was no hurry to fill the spaces left by the past, no need to erase the scars that still marked their skin. Instead, they held each other, letting time stretch thin between the moments. It was an unspoken promise that they would face what came next, not as broken pieces, but as something whole, together. Outside, the stars began to shine, distant and steady. Micah looked up, then back to Naomi, seeing in her eyes a flicker of hope that matched his own. "We're not done yet," he said softly. "No," she agreed, "but we're ready." And in that quiet cabin on the edge of the world, two people cast aside by pain found something more than survival. They found each other.